They sold her like livestock in a smoke-filled saloon, a widow stripped of dignity auctioned to the highest bidder, while frontier scum laughed and leered. But when a Comanche warrior laid down gold and called her fire, everything changed. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan, sold like trash, loved like wildfire, and reborn in the arms of a man society called savage. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of defiance and redemption travels across this broken, beautiful world. The spring of 1862 came to Bitter Creek like a promise it had no intention of keeping. The town squatted on the edge of civilization, a festering wound of wooden storefronts and false morality where decent folk went to church on Sunday and spat on widows come Monday. The streets ran with mud and whiskey in equal measure, and the air always carried the stench of horse dung, coal smoke, and broken dreams. Margaret Sullivan had learned to walk those streets, with her eyes down her shoulders hunched, her black mourning dress collecting dust like shame. 6 months since Thomas died, 6 months since the mine collapse took him and left her with nothing but debts she couldn't pay and a name she couldn't shake. Mrs. Sullivan, they called her still, but the title had curdled into mockery. Widow Sullivan, poor Margaret, that woman. She'd sold everything, the furniture piece by piece, her wedding ring, the silver brush her mother had given her. Everything except the dress on her back and the tattered dignity she clutched like a lifeline. But dignity didn't pay debts, and Bitter Creek had no patience for the poor. It was a Thursday when they came for her. Margaret was scrubbing floors at the boarding house, her knees raw, her hands cracked and bleeding when the door crashed open. 2 men filled the frame, Bull Henderson, all 300 pounds of him, and Silas Crane, thin as a knife and twice as mean. "Time's up, Margaret," Bull said, almost apologetically. "Mr. Morrison wants his money." She didn't look up, kept scrubbing. "I have 3 more weeks. We agreed." Mr. Morrison changed his mind. Silas's voice was sharp. "Says you've had enough charity. Says it's time to settle accounts." Margaret's hands stilled. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could taste copper fear on her tongue. "I have nothing left to give." "Then you'll give yourself." Bull stepped forward, and despite his size, there was genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Margaret, truly, but orders is orders." They hauled her up by her arms, not roughly but firmly, and she didn't fight. What was the point? The whole town knew Jake Morrison owned the saloon, the general store, and half the souls in Bitter Creek, through debt and intimidation. If he wanted payment, he'd get it one way or another. The street fell silent as they dragged her toward the Silver Dollar Saloon. Women pulled their children close and turned away. Men watched with expressions ranging from pity to something darker, hungrier. Margaret kept her chin up even as her cheeks burned with humiliation. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. The saloon was exactly what she expected, dim and reeking of tobacco, spilled beer, and unwashed bodies. Every table was full, though it was barely noon. Men turned to stare as Bull and Silas pushed her through the door, and the piano player's fingers stuttered to a stop mid-song. Jake Morrison stood behind the bar polishing a glass that would never be clean. He was a handsome man, in the way a snake is handsome, all smooth charm and hidden venom. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Gentlemen," he raised his voice, and the room fell silent. "We have before us a matter of business. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan owes me $217, a debt incurred by her late husband, God rest his unfortunate soul." Someone snickered. Margaret's nails bit into her palms. "Now I'm a reasonable man," Morrison continued, setting down the glass. "I don't want to see a lady suffer, so I'm offering a practical solution. Mrs. Sullivan here needs a home protection and the means to survive, and some of you fine gentlemen might need, well, let's call it companionship, or perhaps just a good worker." The meaning crashed over her like ice water. Margaret's stomach turned. "You can't." "I can, and I am." Morrison's smile widened. Consider it an auction, Mrs. Sullivan, though I use the term loosely. You'll go to whoever offers the most, whether as wife-servant or—" He let the sentence hang ugly implications, filling the silence. The room erupted. Men shouted bids and jeers in equal measure. $50, $75. One man offered a horse and 3 months' labor. Another promised a warm bed and regular meals, and the laughter that followed made Margaret's skin crawl. She stood in the center of it all, shaking with rage and terror and a desperate, drowning shame. This was what her life had come to. This was how Bitter Creek saw her, not as a woman, not even as a human being, but as property to be sold, flesh to be bartered. $100, a voice called from the back. $120, another countered. Margaret closed her eyes. In her mind, she was somewhere else. Anywhere else. She was back in Philadelphia before Thomas, before the West, before everything went wrong. She was— The door crashed open. The sound cut through the chaos like a gunshot. Every head turned. The shouting died. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the harsh noon sun, and for a moment he was nothing but a silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, utterly still. Then he stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He was Comanche. There was no mistaking it. The copper skin, the long black hair bound with leather strips, the buckskin clothing that marked him as explicitly, defiantly other. But it was his eyes that struck Margaret most dark and fathomless, carrying an intensity that made grown men shift uncomfortably. And beside him, small hand clutched in his larger one, was a child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, with the same dark eyes and solemn expression. The stranger's gaze swept the room, taking in the leering men, the smoke, the woman in black standing at the center like a sacrifice. When he spoke, his English was perfect, each word carefully chosen. "What is the price?" Morrison recovered first, his salesman's instinct overriding his surprise. "Well, now we don't usually, that is, I'm not sure. The price." Not a question this time, a command. "200, Morrison said quickly, "plus 17 for interest." The stranger reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a handful of coins. He crossed the room, men scrambling out of his way, and laid the gold on the bar with deliberate precision. The coins gleamed in the dim light, more money than most of these men saw in a year. Morrison's eyes went wide. He reached for the gold, but the stranger's hand shot out, pinning Morrison's wrist to the bar. "You call her trash," the stranger said quietly. "You sell her like an animal." Morrison tried to pull away, failed. "Now, see here, I see." The stranger's voice was soft, dangerous. "I see men without honor. I see a woman without choice. I see your civilization." He released Morrison's wrist and pushed the gold forward. "I pay your price, but understand this, I claim her not as trash, but as fire. And fire, Mr. Morrison, is stronger than men like you will ever be." The room held its breath. Margaret stared at this stranger, this Comanche warrior who had just bought her freedom, with words that made her chest tight and strange. He turned to her, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes: respect, question, choice. "I am Daniel Crowfeather," he said. "This is my son, Little Wolf. I offer you safety, a home until spring, and your freedom to choose your own path." He paused. "Will you come?" Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to take any option but the one this savage, no, this man was offering. The whole town was watching. If she left with him, she would be more than shunned. She would be erased, dead to decent society. But decent society had just tried to sell her to the highest bidder. Margaret looked at Morrison, at the men still staring with their hungry eyes at the door beyond which Bitter Creek waited to consume her whole. Then she looked back at Daniel Crowfeather and his solemn-eyed son. She took a breath that hurt. "I'll go." The words were barely a whisper, but they echoed like a gunshot. Daniel nodded once, then turned to Morrison. "The debt is paid. She is free." "Now wait just a minute," Morrison started. "Free," Daniel repeated. and something in his voice made Morrison step back. "Any man who follows us will not return. Any man who speaks against her will answer to me. Are we understood?" No one answered. No one dared. Daniel placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, then gestured to Margaret. "Come, we have a long ride ahead." She moved as if in a dream, her legs unsteady, her whole body trembling. As she passed Morrison, he hissed, "You're dead to this town, Margaret. Dead to decent folk. You know that, don't you?" She stopped, turned, and for the first time in 6 months, she smiled. "Good," she said. "I was dying here anyway." Outside, the sun was blinding after the saloon's dimness. 2 horses waited, a large buckskin and a smaller paint pony. Daniel helped her onto the buckskin with surprising gentleness, then lifted Little Wolf onto the pony. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I learned," Margaret said, Before everything." He nodded, swung onto the buckskin behind her. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she stiffened instinctively. "I will not harm you," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "You have my word. A Comanche's word is not given lightly." She didn't respond, didn't trust herself to speak. But as they rode out of Bitter Creek, past the staring faces, past the judgment and cruelty and smallness, she felt something shift inside her chest. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely, but also possibility. The town fell away behind them, and Margaret Sullivan did not look back. They rode for hours, the landscape changing from the muddy streets of Bitter Creek to rolling grassland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The spring air was cool and clean, nothing like the stale atmosphere of the town. Margaret had forgotten that air could taste like this, like freedom, like distance, like hope. Daniel said nothing, but his presence behind her was steady, solid. Little Wolf rode ahead on the paint pony, occasionally glancing back at them, with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Wariness, maybe. Curiosity. The boy's silence felt different from his father's, less comfortable, more watchful. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Daniel guided them toward a stand of cottonwood trees near a creek. "We camp here tonight," he said, the first words he'd spoken since leaving Bitter Creek. He dismounted smoothly, then offered his hand to help Margaret down. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground. Hours of riding after months of scrubbing floors had left her weak, trembling. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing to a fallen log. "Rest. Little Wolf and I will make camp." She wanted to argue, to prove she could be useful, but her body betrayed her. She sank onto the log and watched as father and son moved through the tasks of setting up camp with practiced efficiency. Little Wolf gathered kindling while Daniel unsaddled the horses and started a fire. Their movements were synchronized, almost ritualistic, speaking of countless nights just like this one. When the fire crackled to life, Daniel produced strips of dried meat and something that looked like flat bread from his saddlebag. He offered them to Margaret first, and she realized with a start that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the food. "Pia," Little Wolf said suddenly, his first word. At Daniel's encouraging nod, the boy repeated, "Pia means thank you in Comanche." Margaret looked at the child, really looked at him for the first time. He had his father's intense eyes, but there was something softer around his mouth, something that suggested he could smile if he chose to. "Pia," she echoed carefully. "Thank you, Little Wolf." The boy's expression didn't change, but she thought she saw a flicker of something, approval maybe, before he turned back to his food. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant calls of night birds. Margaret's mind raced with questions she didn't know how to ask. Who were these people? Where were they taking her? What did Daniel expect in return for the fortune he'd spent to buy her freedom? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel spoke. "You have questions, ask them." Margaret set down her food, suddenly unable to eat. "Why did you do it? Why pay all that money for a stranger?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. 3 years ago, my wife Morning Star was sick. We went to Bitter Creek for medicine. The doctor refused to help, said he didn't treat savages. He paused, and Margaret saw his jaw tighten. She died 2 days later. Little Wolf was 3 years old. The boy's head was down now, his small shoulders hunched. I swore then, Daniel continued, that I would never let cruelty go unanswered when I had the power to stop it. When I walked into that place today and saw what they were doing to you, he looked at her directly, and she saw old pain in his eyes and something fiercer. I saw my wife. I saw every person this world has called less than. I could not walk away. Margaret's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Say nothing. The debt is mine to carry, not yours. But I can't just accept. What do you want from me? Daniel's expression softened slightly. I want nothing. You are free, Margaret Sullivan. Truly free. When we reach my camp, you may stay as long as you wish. Learn our ways or don't. Heal, find your strength, decide your own path. And when spring comes, if you wish to leave, I will take you to any town you choose. I will give you enough gold to start again. He paused. No strings, no payment required. Just be free. It was too much, too generous, too impossible. Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she fought them back. I don't understand. Men don't do things like this. There's always a price. Then I am not like other men. Daniel stood, brushing off his buckskins. And you are not property to be bought or sold. Sleep, Margaret. Tomorrow the real journey begins. He moved to check on the horses, leaving Margaret alone with Little Wolf. The boy was watching her now, his dark eyes unreadable in the firelight. Your father is a good man, Margaret said softly. Little Wolf considered this. He is strong and sad, both things. The simple honesty of it struck her. Yes, she agreed. Both things. The boy nodded, apparently satisfied, and curled up in his bedroll. Within minutes, his breathing had evened into sleep. Margaret sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and spark. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It wasn't even hope exactly. But it was space, room to breathe, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. She looked up at the stars, so many of them undimmed by town lights or wood smoke. They looked the way they had when she was a girl, before she knew about debt and death and the cruelty of desperate men. Thank you, she whispered to the night, to Daniel, to whatever force had brought her to this moment. Pia. And for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret Sullivan slept without nightmares. Dawn broke soft and golden over the prairie, the kind of morning that made promises the world rarely kept. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, strong and bitter, and the sound of Little Wolf's quiet laughter as his father taught him to skip stones across the creek. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the absence of fear, by the strange peace of waking somewhere that didn't hate her. Daniel looked up as she stirred, his expression unreadable in the early light. There's coffee, he said simply, and we should move soon. We have 3 days' ride to my camp. 3 days. Margaret sat up slowly, every muscle in her body screaming protest. She wasn't used to riding anymore, wasn't used to sleeping on the ground, wasn't used to any of this. But she took the tin cup Daniel offered and wrapped her hands around its warmth, grateful beyond words. Little Wolf approached cautiously, a smooth stone clutched in his small fist. You try, he asked, holding it out to her. Margaret blinked, surprised. I don't know how to skip stones. The boy's eyes widened as if she'd confessed to not knowing how to breathe. He looked at his father, who smiled, the first real smile Margaret had seen on Daniel's face, and it transformed him completely. Then we teach you, Daniel said, before we ride. So there, by a nameless creek in the middle of nowhere, A Comanche warrior and his son taught a Philadelphia widow how to make stones dance across water. Margaret's first attempts were disasters, the stones plunking straight down, sending up graceless splashes. Little Wolf giggled, a sound like bells, and even Daniel's mouth twitched with suppressed amusement. "Like this," Daniel said, moving behind her. His hand covered hers, adjusting her grip, the angle of her wrist. "Feel the weight. Release at the right moment. The stone wants to fly you. Just help it remember how." His touch was gentle, impersonal, but Margaret's breath caught anyway. She could smell sage and leather and something else, something wild and clean that had no name. When he stepped back, she tried again, and this time the stone skipped once, twice before sinking. Little Wolf whooped and splashed into the shallow water, his earlier wariness forgotten. Again. They spent 20 minutes there, and Margaret felt something inside her chest crack open, something that had been sealed tight since the mine collapse, since the funeral. Since Bitter Creek had shown her exactly how much a woman's life was worth. Here, in this moment, she was just a person learning to skip stones. Nothing more, nothing less, and it was enough. When they finally mounted up and continued their journey, the atmosphere had shifted. Little Wolf chattered more freely, pointing out birds and prairie dogs and cloud shapes. Daniel remained quieter, but there was an ease to his silence now, a comfort that hadn't existed before. The landscape changed as they rode the grassland, giving way to rolling hills, then to rougher country, where red rocks thrust up from the earth like broken bones. Margaret had never seen anything like it. Philadelphia had been all brick and cobblestone, and even Bitter Creek had been flat and ordinary. This was ancient, wild, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "Your people," she ventured as they paused to water the horses at midday. "Do they know you went to Bitter Creek? Do they know about me?" Daniel's expression clouded. "They know I went to trade. They do not yet know about you. Will they be angry? Some will." He met her eyes squarely. "My people have suffered much from white men. Broken treaties, stolen land, disease, massacre. There are those who see any white person as enemy. I cannot promise you will be welcomed." Margaret's stomach knotted. "Then why bring me there at all? Why not just—" "Because I gave my word." Daniel's voice was firm. "And because you have nowhere else to go. My sister Shining Bird will help you. She is wise and kind, and she understands that the color of skin does not determine the color of a heart." He paused. "But yes, it will be difficult. You must be prepared for that." "I've been unwanted before," Margaret said quietly. "I think I can survive it again." Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, respect maybe, or recognition of shared pain. "Yes," he said, "I believe you can." They rode on through the afternoon heat, and as the sun began its descent, Little Wolf suddenly pointed ahead. "Smoke, Papa, smoke from camp." Daniel's posture changed, immediately became alert, protective. But when Margaret tensed, he shook his head. "Our smoke. We are close now. One more hill." They crested the rise, and Margaret's breath caught. Below them, in a sheltered valley where a river curved like a silver snake, was the Comanche camp. Dozens of teepees spread across the grassland, their buffalo hide walls painted with symbols and stories. Horses grazed in herds, children ran between the lodges, and smoke rose from countless fires into the darkening sky. It was beautiful, terrifying, completely foreign. "Stay close to me," Daniel said quietly. "Let me speak first. And Margaret, do not show fear. They will sense it, and it will make things harder." She nodded, her mouth too dry for words. As they descended into the valley, people began to notice. Conversations stopped. Children paused in their games. By the time they reached the edge of camp, a crowd had gathered. An older man stepped forward, his face weathered and stern, his gray hair bound with eagle feathers. He spoke in rapid Comanche, his tone sharp with question and challenge. Daniel responded in the same language, his voice calm but authoritative. The exchange went back and forth, growing heated. and Margaret caught Daniel's name, her own name, translated to something that sounded like fire woman, and words that needed no translation: anger, disapproval, concern. Then a woman pushed through the crowd. She was younger than Margaret, beautiful in a fierce way, with long black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke to Daniel, her tone softer than the old man's, but no less intense. Daniel replied, and the woman turned to study Margaret with an expression that was carefully neutral. "This is my sister Shining Bird," Daniel said in English. "She will take you to her lodge. You will stay with her family." Shining Bird stepped closer, and Margaret forced herself not to retreat. The Comanche woman circled her slowly, taking in the black dress, the worn shoes, the pale skin, burned pink by 2 days of sun. When she spoke, her English was accented but clear. "You are the one my brother bought." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Yes. You understand what you have walked into, the danger, the hatred some of my people carry." "I understand I had no choice," Margaret said, lifting her chin. "I understand your brother offered me something no one else would a chance to live. And I understand that I'm not welcome here, but I'm here anyway." Shining Bird's eyes narrowed, then unexpectedly she smiled. It was a small smile, cautious but real. "You have spine, fire woman. Good, you will need it." She glanced at her brother. "She can stay with me, but Daniel, you must face the council, tonight." Daniel nodded grimly. "I know." Shining Bird turned back to Margaret. "Come, I will show you where you sleep, where you work, what you must do to survive here." She paused. "And what you must never do if you wish to keep breathing." Margaret followed Shining Bird through the camp, acutely aware of every stare, every whisper. Little Wolf had been swept up by a group of children, his earlier solemnity replaced by excited chatter as he told them about the stone skipping lesson. But Margaret had no such distraction. She was alone, a white woman in a Comanche camp, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Shining Bird's tipi was larger than Margaret expected, beautifully decorated with paintings of horses and stars. Inside it was warm and surprisingly comfortable, with buffalo robes spread on the ground and a small fire pit in the center. A man sat there working on a bow, Shining Bird's husband, Margaret assumed. He looked up, his expression hardening when he saw her. "This is Takes the Shot," Shining Bird said. "My husband. He does not speak English, and he does not trust white people. Do not take it personally, he has reasons." She said something in Comanche, and the man grunted, returned to his work, without acknowledging Margaret further. "You will sleep here." Shining Bird continued, pointing to a space near the tipi wall. "You will help with cooking, preparing hides, gathering wood and water. You will learn our language, our customs. You will work hard, fire woman, harder than you have ever worked, because if you do not prove your worth, there are those who will demand Daniel send you away, or worse." Margaret swallowed hard. "I understand." "Do you?" Shining Bird studied her intently. "In your town they sold you like an animal. Here some would rather see you dead than living among us. You have traded one kind of hatred for another. My brother believes you are strong enough to survive this. I am not yet convinced." "Then watch," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Watch and decide for yourself. But I won't run, I won't break. I've already lost everything. What more can they take from me?" Shining Bird's expression shifted, became something almost like approval. "Perhaps you are fire after all," she murmured. "Come, I will show you the river where we get water. You will need to fetch some before the council meets tonight." They walked through the camp, and Margaret noticed how people responded to Shining Bird with respect, with warmth, with easy familiarity. And she noticed how those same people looked at her with suspicion, anger, or cold indifference. One old woman spat on the ground as they passed. A young warrior made a gesture Margaret didn't understand, but Shining Bird's sharp rebuke suggested it wasn't kind. At the river, several women were already gathered, filling water skins and washing clothes. Their conversation died when Margaret approached. Shining Bird spoke to them firmly in Comanche, and though Margaret couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. This woman is under my protection. Respect that or answer to me. One of the women, middle-aged with kind eyes, responded quietly. Shining Bird nodded, then turned to Margaret. This is Quiet Rain. She says you remind her of her daughter who died of the white man's spotted sickness 5 years ago. She does not hate you, but she does not trust you either. It is complicated. Margaret looked at Quiet Rain, saw the grief and wariness in equal measure. I'm sorry, she said softly, for your daughter, for everything my people have done to yours. Shining Bird translated, and Quiet Rain's expression flickered surprise, then something softer. She spoke again, and Shining Bird smiled slightly. She says, words are easy, action is truth. She will watch your actions, Fire Woman. We all will. Margaret filled her water skin in silence, acutely aware of being observed, judged, weighed. When they returned to camp, the sun was setting and people were gathering near the largest teepee. Daniel stood at its entrance, his face grave, preparing for the council that would decide Margaret's fate. He caught her eye across the crowd, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or shared determination. Then he disappeared inside, and Shining Bird pulled Margaret back toward her lodge. The council will talk long into the night, she said. Some will say you must go. Some will say you must die for the sins of your people, and Daniel will argue for your life, for his right to offer sanctuary to one who was treated as he and I and all our people have been treated. She paused at the tippy entrance. Sleep if you can, Fire Woman. Tomorrow your real education begins. But Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay on the buffalo robe, listening to the murmur of voices from the council. To Shining Bird and Takes the Shot, speaking quietly in Comanche to the night sounds of a camp settling into rest. She thought about Daniel standing before his people defending a stranger. She thought about Little Wolf's laughter that morning, about stones skipping across water, about the impossible distance between who she had been and who she might become. Sometime deep in the night, she heard footsteps outside. The teepee flap opened and Daniel entered, his face exhausted but determined. He spoke quietly with his sister, then looked at Margaret. The council has decided, he said. You may stay, but there are conditions. Margaret sat up. What conditions? You must learn our language within 3 moons. You must work without complaint. You must respect our ways even when you do not understand them. And most importantly, his voice grew heavy. You must never betray us. Never speak to white soldiers or settlers about this camp, its location, its people. If you do, the penalty is death. No exceptions. I understand, Margaret said. I won't betray you, I swear it. Daniel studied her for a long moment. I believe you, he said finally. I told them you were like us, someone the world discarded, someone who understands what it means to be called less than, someone who deserves a chance to prove her worth. He paused. Do not make me a liar, Margaret Sullivan. I won't, she promised, and meant it with everything she had. He nodded, then turned to leave, but at the entrance he stopped. Tomorrow you begin your new life. It will not be easy. You will be challenged, tested, pushed to your limits. But if you survive it, if you truly become one of us, you will never be sold, discarded, or diminished again. You will be free in ways your old world could never allow. His eyes met hers in the firelight. That is worth fighting for, Fire Woman. Remember that when things grow dark. Then he was gone, and Margaret was left with the weight out of his words. The promise and the warning tangled together like threads in a tapestry she couldn't yet see the pattern of. Shining Bird settled back onto her sleeping robe. Sleep now, she said quietly. At dawn, I will teach you how to be Comanche. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done. Margaret closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. Outside, the camp had fallen silent except for the occasional horse's whinny or the distant howl of a coyote. She was here, truly here, in a world so foreign it might as well be the moon. But she was alive. She was free of Bitter Creek's cruelty, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had a purpose to prove she was more than what they'd called her, more than trash, More than a commodity to be sold, she was fire, and fire, as Daniel had said, was stronger than the men who tried to extinguish it. When dawn came, Margaret woke to Shining Bird shaking her shoulder. "Up, fire woman, the sun does not wait, and neither do we." Thus began the education of Margaret Sullivan, the transformation from widow to something entirely new. Shining Bird was a demanding teacher, patient only to a point, expecting Margaret to learn quickly or suffer the consequences of ignorance. That first morning she taught Margaret the Comanche words. For basic necessities, water, fire, food, yes, no thank you, made her repeat them until her tongue ached with the unfamiliar sounds. Then came the work, real work, harder than anything Margaret had done in Bitter Creek. She learned to scrape buffalo hides until her hands bled, to gather specific roots and plants for medicine, and cooking to build fires that wouldn't smoke too much to carry water without spilling. Every task had a right way and a wrong way, and Shining Bird corrected her constantly, sometimes with words, sometimes with sharp gestures that needed no translation. The other women watched, some with open hostility, others with cautious curiosity. Quiet Rain occasionally offered a word of encouragement or showed Margaret a better technique for whatever she was struggling with. But mostly Margaret worked in isolation, her presence a constant source of tension. Little Wolf became her unexpected ally. The boy would appear at odd moments, teaching her new words, correcting her pronunciation with the brutal honesty of children. No, fire woman, like this, pia mupi, water, say it right. And she would try and fail and try again until he nodded his approval. Daniel she saw rarely. He was often gone hunting or meeting with other warriors, preparing for something he never quite explained. But when their paths crossed, he would ask how she was managing, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of breaking. "I'm still here," she would say, and he would nod, satisfied. 3 weeks into her new life, as Margaret struggled to sew moccasins with sinew that kept breaking, a group of young warriors rode through camp fresh from a hunt. They were loud, triumphant, displaying the elk they'd killed. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, saw Margaret and stopped. He dismounted and walked toward her, his expression cold. He spoke in Comanche, his tone mocking. Margaret didn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. Shining Bird appeared instantly, placing herself between Margaret and the warrior, her voice sharp with warning. The man argued back, gesturing at Margaret with clear disgust. Other people gathered, watching, waiting to see what would happen. Then Daniel's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He strode into the circle, placed himself beside his sister, and spoke directly to the scarred warrior. The exchange was brief but intense, Daniel's authority evident in every word. The warrior spat on the ground near Margaret's feet, a deliberate insult, but backed away, his point made. When the crowd dispersed, Daniel turned to Margaret. "That was Red Lance. His family was killed by the white soldiers 3 years ago. He will never accept you. Stay away from him." Margaret's hands were shaking, but she kept her voice steady. "What did he say? What did he call me?" Daniel hesitated, then sighed. "He called you ghost woman, said you bring death wherever you walk, said I was a fool to bring white poison into our camp." His jaw tightened. "I told him you were under my protection, and any who harm you, answer to me. It will keep most people away. But Red Lance, he is dangerous, Margaret. Be careful." She nodded, swallowing her fear. "Thank you for protecting me again." "I brought you here," Daniel said quietly. "Your safety is my responsibility." He studied her bloody hands, the calluses forming the determination in her eyes despite her exhaustion. "You are doing well, Fire Woman. Better than I expected. Keep going. You are almost through the worst of it." But he was wrong. The worst was still to come. The worst came on a morning that started like any other, with Margaret hauling water from the river in the gray pre-dawn light. She'd grown stronger over the past month. Her hands toughened by work, her Comanche improving enough that she could hold basic conversations. Shining Bird had even smiled at her the day before, a real smile that suggested Margaret might actually be earning her place here. But peace in this world was fragile as morning frost. Margaret was halfway back to camp, the heavy water skin pulling at her shoulders, when she heard horses. Not the usual sounds of the camp's herd, but the thunder of riders coming fast and hard. She turned, shading her eyes against the rising sun, and her blood went cold. A dozen riders crested the hill, and even from a distance she could see they were white men, rough men, the kind Bitter Creek spawned like maggots. And leading them, sitting tall in his saddle with that snake's smile she'd never forget, was Jake Morrison. Margaret dropped the water skin and ran. Her feet pounded the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind screaming a single word, "No, no, no, no." The camp was waking now, people emerging from their lodges at the sound of approaching horses. She saw Daniel exit his tipi, saw him spot the riders, saw his expression shift from confusion to fury to something darker understanding. "Daniel," Margaret's voice cracked as she reached him. "It's Morrison, from Bitter Creek. He's—" "I know." Daniel's hand went to the knife at his belt. Around them, warriors were grabbing weapons. Women were pulling children close, the entire camp, mobilizing with the practiced efficiency of a people who'd learned to expect attack. "Get to Shining Bird's lodge, now." But it was too late. The riders were already flooding into camp, their horses scattering cook fires, their rifles raised. Morrison dismounted with deliberate slowness, his eyes scanning the camp, until they found Margaret. "There she is," he called out, pointing. "Margaret Sullivan, we've come to rescue you from these savages." The word hit like a slap. Margaret saw Redlance's hand tighten on his bow, saw the fury flash across Shining Bird's face, saw Little Wolf duck behind his father's legs. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between Morrison and Margaret. "You are not welcome here. Leave now before blood is shed." Morrison laughed, and the sound was ugly. "Rescue mission Injun. We're here for the white woman you kidnapped. Now hand her over peaceful-like, and we'll be on our way." "Kidnapped?" Margaret's voice shook with rage. She pushed past Daniel, ignoring his hiss of warning. "You sold me, Morrison. You auctioned me off like cattle, and this man paid your price. I went with him freely. That's so." Morrison's smile widened. "Well, we got us a different story back in Bitter Creek. See, some folks got concerned about poor widow Sullivan taken by a savage. Got concerned enough to put together a rescue party, and here we are." One of Morrison's men spat tobacco juice on the ground. "We're liberating you, ma'am, whether you want it or not." The camp was deadly quiet now. Warriors positioned with arrows knocked women gripping knives, children hidden but watching with wide eyes. Margaret could feel the tension thick enough to choke on the violence trembling just beneath the surface. "I don't need liberating," Margaret said, forcing her voice steady. "I'm free here, freer than I ever was in your rotten town." Morrison's expression hardened. "You're confused, Margaret. Stockholm Syndrome, they call it. These savages got you thinking wrong, but don't you worry, we'll get you home, get you right in the head again." "This is my home now." The words came out stronger than Margaret felt. "And these people have shown me more honor in 5 weeks than you showed me in 6 months. So you can take your rescue and—" "Enough." Morrison's hand went to his rifle. "Boys, seize the woman. Kill any Injun that gets in the way." Everything happened at once. Daniel lunged forward, his knife flashing. Morrison's men surged into the camp. Arrows flew. A gunshot cracked the morning air, and someone screamed. Margaret saw Redlance shoot one of Morrison's men clean through the chest, saw Shining Bird grab a child and run, saw Takes the Shot grappling with a bearded man twice his size, and then rough hands grabbed her from behind. Margaret screamed, thrashing her nails, finding flesh and raking deep. The man cursed and backhanded her, stars exploding across her vision. Through the haze she saw Little Wolf, brave, foolish Little Wolf, charging at her captor with a stick raised like a weapon. "No!" The word tore from her throat. "Little Wolf, run!" But another of Morrison's men caught the boy, lifting him by his shirt. Little Wolf kicked and bit wild as a trapped animal, and the man shook him hard. "Shut up, you little—" Something primal awakened in Margaret. She'd spent 6 months being pushed down, sold off, discarded. She'd spent 5 weeks learning to survive in a world that didn't want her, and she was done being a victim. She twisted in her captor's grip, brought her heel down hard on his instep. When he loosened his hold, she spun and drove her knee into his groin with every ounce of strength she possessed. He went down gasping, and she was already moving, diving for the rifle he'd dropped. Her hands closed around the weapon Thomas had taught her to shoot a lifetime ago when things were simple, and she swung it up, cocking it with a click that sounded like thunder. The man holding Little Wolf froze, his eyes going wide. "Let him go." Margaret's voice was barely human, scraped raw with fury and fear and something else, something fierce and unbreakable. "Let him go, or I swear to God, I'll paint this ground with your brains." The man looked at Morrison, uncertain. Morrison's face was red with rage. "You wouldn't dare, you stupid!" Margaret fired. The bullet whined past Morrison's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it, and his words died in his throat. She worked the bolt, chambering another round, the rifle now aimed dead center at his chest. "I said let the boy go." The man released Little Wolf, and the child scrambled away, running straight to his father. Daniel caught him, checked him for injuries, his eyes never leaving Margaret. In them she saw shock, respect, and something else she couldn't name. "You've lost your mind," Morrison sputtered. "You'd kill your own kind for these savages." "My own kind." Margaret laughed, and it was a broken sound. "My own kind sold me, beat me, tried to auction me to the highest bidder. These savages gave me food, shelter, and dignity. So yes, Morrison, I would kill you for them, gladly." Around them the fighting had stopped. Morrison's remaining men, 5 of them now, 2 dead and 3 wounded, were surrounded by Comanche warriors, arrows and knives at their throats. The air stank of gunpowder and blood, and in the distance Margaret could hear a woman keening for the dead. Daniel stepped forward, still holding Little Wolf. When he spoke, his voice was cold as winter. "You have one chance. Take your dead, take your wounded, and leave. Never return. If I see any white face near this camp again, I will kill them on sight. Do you understand?" Morrison's jaw worked, fury and humiliation warring on his face. "The army will hear about this. They'll come. They'll burn this whole camp to the ground. Let them try." Daniel's hand tightened on his knife. "But you won't be here to see it. Because if you're not gone in the next minute, you'll be decorating our lodge poles. Your choice." For a long moment, Morrison just stared at Daniel, at Margaret still holding the rifle, at the Comanche warriors who looked eager for permission to finish this. Then he spat on the ground and turned to his men. "Mount up. We're leaving." "But sir," the woman— "I said mount up." Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. His eyes found Margaret one last time, and the hatred there could have melted steel. "You're dead to decent folk, Margaret. Dead to God himself. You hear me, dead? Good," Margaret said, echoing the words she'd spoken in the saloon a lifetime ago. "I was dying among the decent. I'll live with the indecent. They know more of honor than you ever will." Morrison's face purpled, but he swung onto his horse. His men gathered their dead, hoisted their wounded, and within minutes they were riding out of camp, dust rising in their wake like a curse. The silence they left behind was deafening. Margaret's hands were shaking so hard, the rifle slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her hollow, trembling. Around her the camp was a chaos of activity, warriors checking for more attackers, women tending to the wounded elders conferring in urgent tones. Little Wolf broke free from his father and ran to Margaret, throwing his small arms around her neck. "You saved me, Fire Woman. You saved me." She held him close, burying her face in his hair, feeling the hot tears finally come. "You saved me first," she whispered. "You and your father. I just returned the favor." Daniel approached slowly, and when Margaret looked up at him, she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Wonder, maybe, or recognition. He offered his hand and she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "You could have gone with them," he said quietly. "Back to your world, your people. Instead you—" "They're not my people," Margaret interrupted. "Not anymore. Maybe they never were." Shining Bird appeared, her face grim. She spoke in Comanche and Daniel's expression darkened. He replied the exchange tense, then turned to Margaret. "2 of our warriors are dead. Red Lance's younger brother among them. The council will convene tonight. After what happened after you defended Little Wolf, stood against your own kind, things will change. But Margaret—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Red Lance will blame you for his brother's death. He will say you brought this violence to our camp, and some will agree with him." Margaret's brief moment of triumph crumbled. Of course it wouldn't be that simple. "What will happen? I don't know, but I will speak for you. I will tell them what I saw, a woman who chose us over her own people, who risked her life for one of our children. I will tell them you have proven yourself in fire and blood." His hand tightened on hers briefly, then released. "Whatever happens tonight, know this, you are no longer a stranger here, Margaret Sullivan. You are kin, and we protect our kin." Shining Bird made a sound, not quite agreement, but not disagreement either. She looked at Margaret with new eyes, assessing, calculating. Then she nodded once, sharply. "Come," she said in English. "We must prepare the dead for burial, and you must prepare for council. Tonight, Fire Woman, you will be judged not by white law or Comanche tradition, but by the truth of your actions. I hope for all our sakes that truth is enough." The day that followed was the longest of Margaret's life. She helped prepare the dead, learning the Comanche burial rituals, her hands gentle on bodies still warm. She worked alongside women who had lost husbands, sons, brothers, and though some still regarded her with suspicion, others nodded their thanks. Quiet rain touched her shoulder as they wrapped the body of Red Lance's brother, a gesture of acknowledgement that spoke louder than words. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, the entire camp gathered. The council lodge was too small for everyone, so they assembled in the open, a great circle with the elders and warriors at the center. Margaret stood with Shining Bird, and Daniel Little Wolf pressed against his father's side, his small hand clutching Daniel's. Red Lance stood across from them, his face a mask of grief and fury. When the eldest councilman gave him permission to speak, his words were like arrows, sharp and deadly. Margaret didn't need translation to understand he was calling for her death, for justice, for revenge. Others spoke, their tones ranging from sympathetic to harsh. The debate went on for what felt like hours, Comanche flowing around Margaret like a river she could only partially navigate. She caught her name, Fire Woman, and Little Wolf's name, and bards she'd learned for death, honor, enemy, family. Then Daniel stood. The crowd fell silent, and even Red Lance stopped his pacing to listen. Daniel spoke for a long time, his voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He gestured to Margaret, to Little Wolf, to the place where Morrison's men had fallen. He spoke of honor and choice, of what it meant to protect the helpless, of the difference between the color of skin and the color of a soul. When he finished, he looked directly at Red Lance. "If you want blood for blood, take mine. I brought her here. I claimed her. Her actions are my responsibility. But do not punish someone who has proven herself willing to die for one of our children. That is not justice. That is vengeance blind to truth." Red Lance's jaw worked. For a moment, Margaret thought he would accept Daniel's challenge, would demand blood. But then Quiet Rain stood, her voice trembling but clear. She spoke briefly, pointing at Margaret, at Little Wolf, and though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she understood the meaning. This woman saved a child. This woman chose us. One by one, others stood to speak, some for Margaret, some against. The eldest councilman listened to all of them, his weathered face revealing nothing. Then he raised his hand for silence and spoke, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Shining Bird leaned close to Margaret. He says you have proven yourself in fire and blood in choice. He says Red Lance's grief is justified, but his blame is misplaced. The white men brought death, not you. You only defended what is ours." She paused, listening. "He says from this day forward you are not Fire Woman, stranger in our camp. You are Tuka Nukuma, Fire who protects. You are one of us if you choose to be." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "What do I say? How do I—" "Say yes or no," Shining Bird said simply. "The choice is yours. It has always been yours." Margaret looked around the circle at Daniel, whose faith in her had never wavered, at Little Wolf, who had trusted her enough to try to save her, at Shining Bird, who had been harder on her than anyone, but had also taught her to survive, at Quiet Rain, whose grief had not blinded her to compassion, and even at Red Lance, whose anger she understood, whose loss she shared in her own way. She thought of Bitter Creek, of Morrison's hateful face, of the life she'd left behind, a life that had valued her less than livestock. And she thought of this life harsh and demanding but honest, a life where worth was measured in actions, not in the color of skin or the size of a bank account. Yes?" she said, her voice carrying. "Yes, I choose this. I choose you. I am Tuka Nukuma, Fire who protects. I am Comanche." The words felt like a door closing and a window opening all at once, like death and birth ending and beginning. The eldest councilman nodded, satisfied. He said something else, and the crowd began to disperse, some still grumbling but most accepting. Red Lance stood for a moment longer, staring at Margaret with eyes full of pain. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders bowed under the weight of loss. Daniel approached Little Wolf in his arms. The boy reached out for Margaret, and she took him, holding him close. "You did well," Daniel said quietly. "You spoke truth when lies would have been easier. You stood when running would have been safer. You chose freely when you could have walked away." His eyes held hers. "I am proud to call you Kintuka Nukuma." Something passed between them in that moment, something deeper than gratitude or respect. Margaret felt it in her chest, warm and terrifying and impossible to name. But before she could examine it, Little Wolf was pulling on her hair, demanding attention, and Shining Bird was calling that there was work to do, that the dead must be honored, and life must continue. That night, as Margaret lay in Shining Bird's lodge, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into uneasy sleep, she realized something. She was no longer afraid. Bitter Creek had taught her that the worst that could happen to a person was to be stripped of dignity, to be reduced to a transaction. But here she had reclaimed something more valuable than dignity. She had reclaimed choice. She had chosen to fight, to protect, to belong. And in making that choice, she had become something new. Not the Philadelphia girl who'd married for love, not the Bitter Creek widow who'd been sold like trash, but Fire who protects a woman forged in the crucible of two worlds, belonging fully to neither but finding her place in the spaces between. Outside, a wolf howled at the moon. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new tests. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without nightmares, her spirit finally at peace. The days following the council meeting brought changes Margaret hadn't anticipated. Women who had previously kept their distance now nodded greetings when she passed. Children who had stared with suspicion now approached shyly, testing her Comanche with giggles when she stumbled over pronunciations. Even Takes the Shot, Shining Bird's perpetually stern husband, grunted what might have been approval when she successfully tanned a hide without ruining it. But the most profound change was in Daniel. He began spending more time near Shining Bird's lodge, ostensibly to check on Little Wolf, but his eyes always found Margaret first. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, moving beyond practical matters into territory that made her pulse quicken. He taught her to track deer, his hand steady on her shoulder as he showed her how to read the forest. She taught Little Wolf the alphabet, scratching letters in the dirt, while Daniel watched with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. 3 weeks after the attack, Daniel found Margaret by the river at dawn. She was washing clothes, her hands red from the cold water, her breath misting in the autumn air. He stood on the bank for a moment just watching, and when she looked up, something in his face made her heart stutter. "Walk with me," he said. Not a command, but not quite a request either. She wrung out the shirt she'd been washing and followed him away from the camp into the cottonwoods that lined the river. Neither spoke until they were out of earshot, the morning birdsong, the only sound besides their footsteps on fallen leaves. Daniel stopped in a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy in golden shafts. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "And I need you to listen without speaking until I'm finished." Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly tight. When Morning Star died, Daniel began staring at the ground. "I thought I died with her. I went through the motions of living, hunting, caring for little Wolf, fulfilling my duties, but inside I was hollow, empty. I told myself I would never feel again, never risk that kind of pain." He paused, his jaw working. "Then I walked into that saloon in Bitter Creek and saw you standing there, and something shifted. Something broke open that I thought was sealed forever." Margaret's breath caught, but she stayed silent, honoring his request. "At first, I told myself it was just recognition, seeing someone else who'd been broken by this world. But these past weeks, watching you learn, watching you fight, watching you become—" He finally looked at her, and the naked vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret. Tuka Nukuma, fire who protects. I'm falling, and I don't know how to stop, and I don't know if you—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I need to know if there's any chance you could feel the same." The world seemed to hold its breath. Margaret stood there, this man's heart offered to her like a fragile, precious thing, and felt the weight of what he was asking, what he was risking. A Comanche warrior, a widower, a father laying himself bare before a woman who had been in his world for barely 2 months. "I'm terrified." She whispered the words, spilling out before she could stop them. "I'm terrified because I feel it too, this thing between us. And I don't know if it's real, or if I'm just grateful, or if I'm confusing safety with love, or—" She pressed her hands to her face. "Thomas died, and I thought I'd never want anyone again, never trust anyone again. But you—" Her voice broke. "You make me want to be brave enough to try." Daniel closed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Then try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Try with me. Let me court you properly in both our ways. Let me show you that what we feel is real, is right, is worth the fear." "What if I fail?" Margaret's hands came up to grip his wrists, needing the anchor. "What if I can't be what you need? What if you can?" Daniel's forehead touched hers, and she could feel his breath on her lips. "What if this is what we were both surviving for? What if the fire that brought you here was meant to forge us into something new, something stronger?" Margaret laughed, shaky and wet. "That's a lot of what-ifs." "Then let me give you a certainty." Daniel pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "I see you, Margaret. Not who you were, not who you're trying to be, but who you are right now in this moment. Brave and broken and beautiful and fierce, and I choose you. Every day I will choose you." The words hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath, remaking her understanding of what it meant to be chosen. Not bought, not claimed by transaction, but chosen freely, wholly, without condition. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, court me, show me, teach me how to love again without fear." Daniel's smile was like sunrise, transforming his entire face, and then he was kissing her, gentle at first, tentative, as if she might shatter. But Margaret pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that tasted like promise and hope and the terrifying beauty of new beginnings. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers again. "Little Wolf will be insufferable," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "He's been asking when I'm going to marry you for the past week." Margaret laughed, the sound bright and free. Has he now? He says you make the best cornbread, and you sing him the right songs, and you don't treat him like a baby. Daniel's arms wrapped around her waist, holding her close. He's not wrong. And what do you say? Margaret asked, her heart hammering. About marriage. I say, Daniel pulled back to look at her fully. I say we take our time. I say we do this right, honor both our traditions, let the love grow strong before we bind it with vows. But I also say, his hand came up to cup her cheek. I will marry you, Tuka Nukuma, when you're ready. When we're both certain, I will stand before both our peoples and claim you as my wife, my partner, my heart. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, something that had been restless and seeking for so long she'd forgotten what peace felt like. I want that, she said. God help me, I want that more than I've wanted anything in years. They stood there in the golden morning light, holding each other, letting the magnitude of what they'd just promised sink in. Somewhere in the distance, Little Wolf's voice called for his father, and they smiled against each other's shoulders. We should go back, Daniel said, but he didn't move. We should, Margaret agreed, but she tightened her hold. Finally, Daniel laughed and stepped back, taking her hand. Come, let's tell Little Wolf he was right. He'll lord it over us for months. They walked back to camp hand in hand, and if people noticed, they said nothing. But Shining Bird took one look at them and smiled a knowing, satisfied smile that suggested she'd seen this coming long before either of them had. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Daniel brought her gifts, a perfectly crafted pair of moccasins, a comb carved from bone, a blanket woven with symbols that meant protection and home. She made him shirts in the Comanche style, cooked his favorite foods, learned the love songs his mother had sung. They spent evenings by the fire with Little Wolf between them, building a family from the fragments of their broken pasts. But love, Margaret learned, did not mean the absence of struggle. A month into their courtship, Daniel fell ill. It started as a cough. Nothing alarming, but within days he was burning with fever, the wound he'd taken during Morrison's attack, a graze he'd dismissed as nothing now, red and angry with infection. Shining Bird did everything she knew, every remedy, every prayer, but Daniel grew worse, slipping in and out of consciousness, his body racked with chills. Margaret refused to leave his side. She sat with him through an endless nights, bathing his forehead with cool water, whispering prayers she'd learned as a child, and prayers she'd learned from quiet rain. Little Wolf curled against her terrified, and she held him with one arm, while her other hand gripped Daniel's, as if she could anchor him to this world through sheer force of will. Don't leave, she whispered when Little Wolf finally slept, when it was just her and Daniel and the darkness. Don't you dare leave me, not now, not when I've just found you. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, fever bright and unfocused. Margaret, he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. I'm here, I'm right here. She pressed his hand to her cheek, let him feel her tears. Stay with me, Daniel, please. I can't do this without you. Strong, he murmured, his thumb moving weakly against her skin. You're so strong, you'll be... No. The word came out fierce, desperate. No, I won't be fine. I need you. Little Wolf needs you. We're supposed to have time, remember, we're supposed to build a life. You promised me, Daniel Crow Feather. You promised to show me how to love without fear, and I'm not afraid anymore. Do you hear me? I love you. I choose you. So you don't get to leave. You don't get to break that promise. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, a flicker of the man beneath the fever. His hand tightened slightly on hers. Love you, he whispered. Loved you from the moment you said you'd go. Knew you were meant to be mine. And then fight, Margaret commanded, her voice breaking. Fight for us, for what we could be, for the life we're supposed to have. She didn't know if he heard her. He slipped back into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and rattling, and Margaret bent over him and wept. She wept for Thomas dead in a mine collapse. She wept for the woman she'd been sold like trash in a frontier saloon. She wept for Morning Star, who had died because hatred was stronger than medicine. And she wept for this impossible, beautiful thing she and Daniel had built from the ashes of their separate hells, this fragile, fierce love that deserved more time. Shining Bird found her like that. At dawn, draped over Daniel's still form, Little Wolf sleeping fitfully against her side. The Comanche woman's face was grave as she knelt beside them, checking Daniel's pulse, his breathing the wound that had poisoned his blood. "He's strong," Shining Bird said quietly, "stronger than most. If he lives through today, through tonight, he'll survive." She paused. "But Margaret Tuka Nukuma, you must prepare yourself. The fever could take him. It has taken stronger men." "It won't take him," Margaret said, lifting her head. Her eyes were swollen, her face streaked with tears, but her voice was steel. "I won't let it." Shining Bird studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then keep doing what you're doing. Keep talking to him. Keep fighting for him. Love sometimes is the strongest medicine." She placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "I'll bring fresh water, more herbs. We'll fight this together." The day passed in a blur of desperate care. Margaret forced medicine between Daniel's lips, bathed him when the fever spiked, wrapped him in blankets when the chills came. Little Wolf helped fetching water, holding his father's hand, singing the songs Daniel had taught him. The boy's face was solemn, too old for his years, but he didn't cry. He just stayed close, a small soldier in the battle for his father's life. As night fell again, Daniel's fever broke. Margaret felt it happen the moment his skin cooled. His breathing evened, his body finally relaxed into real sleep instead of unconscious struggle. She sagged forward, her forehead resting on their joined hands, and released a sob of pure relief. "Thank you," she whispered to whatever forces had been listening. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Little Wolf crawled into her lap, and she held him tight, both of them watching Daniel sleep, watching the color slowly return to his face. Shining Bird checked on them just after midnight, saw Daniel resting peacefully, and allowed herself a small smile. "He'll need days to recover his strength," she said, "but he'll live. Your prayers were answered, Fire, who protects." When Daniel finally woke, truly woke, clear-eyed and aware, it was to find Margaret asleep beside him, her hand still gripping his Little Wolf curled against her other side. He watched them for a long moment, these two people who had become his whole world, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Margaret," he whispered, and she stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a heartbeat she just stared at him, then she was crying again, laughing and crying and pressing kisses to his face, his hands anywhere she could reach. "You stayed," she said between kisses. "You fought. You stayed." Daniel caught her face between his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "You asked me to," he said simply. "You told me you loved me, that you chose me. How could I leave after that? You heard me." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Through the fever you heard every word." Daniel pulled her closer, carefully, mindful of Little Wolf still sleeping between them. "Every plea, every prayer, every promise. And I heard something else too. I heard you say you weren't afraid anymore. Was that true?" Margaret looked at him, at this man who had saved her, courted her, nearly died, and fought his way back because she'd asked him to. "Yes," she said. "It's true. I'm not afraid. Not of this, not of us, not anymore." "Then marry me," Daniel said, the words urgent, raw. "Not eventually, not when we're certain. Now, soon. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth that fearlessness." Margaret laughed, the sound shaky but real. "That's not much of a proposal." "Then let me try again." Daniel shifted, wincing slightly until he could look at her properly. "Margaret Sullivan Tuka Nukuma Fire, who protects you, are the bravest person I have ever known. You have survived what would have broken lesser souls. You have loved my son as your own. You have fought for us when you could have walked away. You have brought light back into a heart I thought was dead forever. Will you do me the honor, the incredible undeserved honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Daniel Crowfeather, I'll marry you. I'll be your wife, Little Wolf's mother, part of your people, part of your life. Yes to all of it." Little Wolf stirred between them, his eyes opening sleepily. "Papa," he mumbled. Then more alert, "Papa, you're awake?" He threw his small arms around Daniel's neck, careful of his weakness, and Daniel held him close. "I'm awake, little one. I'm here." Little Wolf pulled back, looking between his father and Margaret with wide eyes. "Did you ask her? Did she say yes?" Daniel laughed, the sound hoarse but genuine. "I asked. She said yes." The boy whooped, then clapped a hand over his mouth, remembering it was night. But his eyes were shining with joy, and he bounced on the sleeping robes. "I knew it. I told you, Papa. I told you she was supposed to be my new mama." Margaret pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. "Is that okay with you, Little Wolf?" "Really okay?" The boy looked at her with absolute seriousness. "My first mama loved me. She's in the stars now, but you love me too, and Papa, and you make us happy. That's what mamas do, right? Make their family happy." "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret's voice broke. "Yes, that's what mamas do, and I promise you I will spend every day trying to make you and your papa happy. And we'll make you happy too," Little Wolf declared with the certainty of childhood. "Right, Papa, right." Daniel agreed, pulling them both close despite his weakness. "We'll make each other happy. That's what families do." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, until dawn broke across the prairie. And when Shining Bird came to check on Daniel in the morning, she found them asleep together, father-son, and the woman who had been sold like trash, but had proven herself to be fire-fierce and unbreakable and bright enough to light the darkest nights. News of the impending marriage spread through the camp like wildfire. The elders convened and agreed to perform a ceremony that would honor both Comanche tradition and the Christian faith. Margaret still held in her heart. It would be, they said, a bridge between two worlds, fitting for a couple who had built their love in the space between cultures. Daniel recovered slowly, gaining strength day by day, and Margaret rarely left his side. They planned their future in quiet moments, dreaming aloud about the life they would build, the children they might have, the family they would become. Little Wolf appointed himself the official wedding planner, insisting on specific songs and foods and declaring that he would stand between them during the ceremony because "I'm the bridge. Remember, Papa said I'm the bridge of fire." And through it all, Margaret felt something she'd thought lost, forever hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of Bitter Creek, but something stronger, something forged in fire and blood and choice. The hope of a woman who had been sold, discarded, deemed worthless, but who had found worth in the last place she expected. In the arms of a man society called savage. In the heart of a people she'd been taught to fear. In a love that defied every rule, every expectation, every limitation the world had tried to place on her soul. She was fire who protects. She was Margaret Sullivan. She was Tuka Nukuma. She was bride, mother, warrior, survivor. And she was finally, gloriously, impossibly free. The wedding was set for the first full moon of winter, giving Daniel time to fully recover and the camp time to prepare. Margaret threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised even Shining Bird. She learned the traditional Comanche marriage customs, practicing the words she would speak until they felt natural on her tongue. She sewed her wedding dress herself, a combination of white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork and a simple veil fashioned from fabric. Quiet Rain had saved for years, a gift given with tears and blessings. But as the day approached, shadows crept in at the edges of Margaret's newfound happiness. Red Lance had grown increasingly volatile, his grief over his brother's death curdling into something dangerous. He watched Margaret with undisguised hatred, muttering to anyone who would listen that she was a curse, that marrying her would bring destruction upon them all. Daniel confronted him one cold morning, their voices carrying across the camp. Margaret couldn't hear the words, but she saw the rigid set of Daniel's shoulders, the fury in Red Lance's gestures. When Daniel returned, his face was grim. "He won't stop," Daniel said quietly, pulling Margaret aside. "He's gathering others who share his feelings. Not many, but enough to be dangerous. He's demanding the council forbid our marriage, calling it a betrayal of our people." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Maybe we should wait. Maybe if we—" "No." Daniel's hands framed her face, his eyes fierce. "No more waiting, no more letting others dictate our lives. We marry when we planned, and anyone who objects can take it up with me directly." "Daniel, I don't want to cause division. I don't want your people to suffer because of me." "My people have suffered because of hatred and fear for generations," Daniel said softly. "Our marriage, it's a choice for something different. Love over fear. Unity over division. If we back down now, we tell them fear wins. I won't do that. Not anymore." Shining Bird, who had been listening, spoke up. "My brother is right, and he is not alone in this. Many of us see what you represent, Margaret. Hope, change, the possibility that we can learn to judge people by their hearts rather than their skin. Red Lance and his followers are loud, but they are few." Margaret wanted to believe them, but doubt gnawed at her. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped out of the lodge and walked to the edge of camp. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the prairie. She stood there, breathing the cold air, trying to quiet the chaos in her mind. "Fire woman." She spun to find Red Lance standing behind her, his face half in shadow. Her heart hammered, but she held her ground. "You should not be here," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Neither should you." Red Lance moved closer, and Margaret saw the pain beneath his anger, the raw grief he wore like armor. "You do not belong here. You never will. That's not your decision to make, isn't it?" His laugh was bitter. "My brother died because of you, because your people came looking for you, and now you think you can just, marry one of us play at being Comanche. You are Poison Fire Woman. Everything you touch dies." The words hit like physical blows, each one finding the fears Margaret tried so hard to silence. "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered. "I didn't ask to be sold. I didn't ask to be brought here. I didn't ask for Morrison to attack, but I'm here, and I'm trying, and I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry about your brother, but my being here didn't kill him. Hatred killed him, the same hatred you're carrying now." Red Lance's hand went to his knife, and Margaret's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought he might actually use it. Then a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Step away from her." Daniel emerged from the darkness. His rifle raised, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him stood Takes the Shot Shining Bird, and half a dozen other warriors, all armed and ready. Red Lance's jaw worked, his hand still on his knife. "This doesn't concern you anymore, Daniel. This is between me and the white woman who brought death to our camp." "Everything concerning her concerns me," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "She is my promised wife. An attack on her is an attack on me. Choose your next move very carefully, Red Lance, because it will determine whether you live to see morning." The standoff stretched tension thick enough to choke on. Margaret could see Red Lance calculating, weighing his grief against the odds before him. Finally, slowly, he released his knife and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's. "The spirits know what she is. They will bring judgment even if we do not." "Then let the spirits decide," Daniel said. "But you will stay away from her. If I find you near her again, grief or no grief, I will end you. Are we clear?" Red Lance spat on the ground between them and stalked away, disappearing into the darkness. The warriors relaxed slightly, but Daniel kept his rifle up until Red Lance was completely out of sight. Then he turned to Margaret, and the fury in his expression crumbled into concern. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" Margaret shook her head, her whole body trembling now that the danger had passed. "Just words. But Daniel, what if he's right? What if I am poison? What if—" Daniel pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her so tightly she could barely breathe. Stop listening to the voice of fear. You are not poison. You are not a curse. You are the woman I love. The woman who saved my son, the woman who has earned her place here 100 times over. But the division, the anger, has always been here. Shining Bird interjected, stepping forward. Red Lance's hatred existed long before you arrived. You are just the convenient target for pain that has nowhere else to go. She placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Do not let his grief become your shame. You have done nothing wrong. Takes the shot spoke in Comanche, and Shining Bird translated. My husband says Red Lance dishonors his brother's memory with this hatred. He says your actions during the attack showed more courage than Red Lance has shown in his entire life. He says, she paused, a small smile touching her lips. He says if you can face down white men with rifles, you can certainly face down one grief-mad warrior. Despite everything, Margaret laughed, a shaky, desperate sound, but real. Tell him thank you. Tell him I'm honored. The warriors dispersed, taking up positions around the camp's perimeter, unwilling to leave anything to chance. Daniel led Margaret back toward the lodges, but she stopped him before they reached Shining Bird's tipi. Daniel, I need to know something. She looked up at him, searching his face in the moonlight. If this continues, if Red Lance keeps pushing, if it comes down to choosing between peace in your camp and marrying me, what would you choose? Daniel's expression softened, and he cupped her face with such tenderness it made her ache. I would choose you, he said simply. Every time I would choose you, not because you're more important than my people, but because choosing you is choosing love over hate, hope over fear, future over past, and that's the choice I want to make, the man I want to be. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, and I intend to spend my life making sure you get it. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. 3 more days, Margaret. 3 more days, and you'll be my wife, and no one, not Red Lance, not the past, not fear itself will ever separate us again. Those 3 days passed in a blur of final preparations and mounting tension. Red Lance made no more direct moves, but his presence hung over the camp like a storm cloud. Margaret tried to focus on the joy, on Little Wolf's excitement, on the beautiful dress she'd made, on the future, stretching before her bright with possibility. But fear had a way of creeping in during quiet moments, whispering that she was wrong, that she didn't belong. That disaster waited just around the corner. The night before the wedding, Shining Bird performed a traditional ceremony, cleansing Margaret with sage smoke and speaking blessings in Comanche that made the other women present nod their approval. Quiet rain washed Margaret's hair with herbs that smelled of summer, her hands gentle, her eyes kind. Tomorrow, Quiet Rain said in halting English, you become one of us, truly. Forever, no more fire woman, just woman, wife, mother, sister. She paused, smiled. Friend. Margaret gripped her hand, overwhelmed. Thank you for everything, for accepting me when you had every reason not to. Your heart showed me who you are, Quiet Rain said simply. The rest skin words past is just noise. Heart is truth. That night Margaret lay awake, her mind racing. Tomorrow she would marry Daniel. Tomorrow she would become Little Wolf's mother. In truth, not just in heart. Tomorrow she would pledge herself to a people, a way of life. A future she could never have imagined that day in Bitter Creek, when Morrison tried to sell her like livestock. She thought of Thomas dead these many months. She wondered what he would think of who she'd become, what choices she'd made. Would he understand? Would he approve? Or would he see her as Red Lance did, as someone who had betrayed her own kind, abandoned her roots, become something unrecognizable? But then she remembered the woman she'd been with, Thomas. Small, constrained, living a half-life dictated by propriety and expectation. and she thought of who she was now, scarred and strong, fierce and free, capable of violence and tenderness in equal measure. Thomas had loved the girl she'd been, but Daniel loved the woman she'd become. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Thomas's memory. "I'm sorry I couldn't stay the person you married, but I think you'd want me to be happy, and I am Thomas. I finally am." Dawn came too quickly and not fast enough. Margaret woke to Shining Bird shaking her shoulder. Little Wolf bouncing excitedly at the entrance of the lodge, the whole camp already stirring with preparation. "Today you marry," Shining Bird said, and there was genuine warmth in her eyes. "Today you choose us, and we choose you. Come, Fire Woman, let us make you beautiful." The women of the camp descended on Margaret, helping her dress painting symbols on her face and arms, weaving feathers and beads into her hair. Each touch felt like a blessing, each woman's smile a form of acceptance. Even those who had been coldest to her offered small nods, quiet acknowledgments that she had earned this moment. When they finally led her out into the winter sunlight, the entire camp was gathered in a great circle. At the center stood Daniel, wearing his finest buckskins, decorated with quillwork and paint, his long hair bound with leather and eagle feathers. Little Wolf stood beside him, practically vibrating with excitement, wearing a smaller version of his father's outfit. And despite everything, despite Red Lance's hatred, despite the whispers and doubts, despite the impossible odds that had brought them to this moment, Daniel looked at Margaret and smiled. A smile of pure joy, pure love, pure certainty. The eldest councilman began the ceremony, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He spoke of marriage as a joining not just of two people, but of two worlds, two ways of seeing two paths becoming one. He spoke of Morning Star, Daniel's first wife, honoring her memory and her place in Little Wolf's heart. And he spoke of Margaret Fire, who had proven herself worthy through trial and blood and choice. Daniel spoke his vows in Comanche first, the words ancient and powerful promises of protection and provision and love that would endure beyond death itself. Then he repeated them in English, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "I vow to honor you in both our languages, both our ways. I vow to stand beside you against all who would diminish you, all who would harm you, all who would deny your worth. I vow to love you fiercely and tenderly, in joy and in sorrow, in peace and in war. You are my heart, Margaret, my fire, my home." Margaret's turn came and her voice shook at first, then grew stronger. "I vow to walk this path with you, even when it's hard, even when I stumble. I vow to be mother to Little Wolf, to love him as my own, to honor the woman who carried him first. I vow to be true to your people, to learn their ways, to fight for their future as my own. And I vow," her voice broke, tears streaming freely now, "I vow to love you, Daniel Crowfeather, with everything I am and everything I'm becoming. You saw fire when the world saw trash. You gave me freedom when I had nothing left. You are my salvation, my love, my choice, today and always." The councilman nodded, satisfied. He spoke the final blessing, binding them together with words older than memory. And then Daniel was pulling Margaret close, kissing her as the crowd erupted in cheers and ululations, the sound rising to the winter sky like smoke. Little Wolf squeezed between them, wrapping his arms around both their legs. "We're a family now," he declared, his voice muffled against their bodies. "A real family." Daniel scooped him up, balancing him on one hip, while his other arm stayed wrapped around Margaret. "We are, little one, a real family." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. There was food more than she'd seen in one place since leaving Philadelphia, and music, drums, and voices rising in songs that made her heart race and her feet move without conscious thought. Daniel taught her the dances, his hands steady on her waist, his laughter bright when she stumbled. Little Wolf danced with them, then with other children, then back to them again, unable to contain his joy. Even some who had been skeptical offered congratulations. Quiet Rain embraced Margaret, whispering blessings. takes the shot actually smiled, a rare sight that made Shining Bird laugh with delight. Warriors who had watched her with suspicion now nodded respect. Women who had kept their distance offered gifts, a blanket, a basket, a carefully carved spoon, as the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel led Margaret away from the celebration to a small rise overlooking the camp. Below them the fires burned bright, the music continued, Little Wolf's laughter carrying on the wind. "Happy?" Daniel asked, pulling her against his chest. Margaret leaned into him, breathing in the scent of sage and leather and home. "I didn't know I could be this happy. I didn't know happiness like this existed." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. "After Morning Star, I thought joy was finished for me, that I'd live in shadow forever. But you," he turned her to face him, "you brought light back, not to replace what I lost, but to exist alongside it, to prove that hearts can hold both grief and joy, both memory and new love." "I love you," Margaret said, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Daniel said, kissing her softly. "Love should be a little terrifying. It means we have something worth protecting, worth fighting for. And fire who protects." He smiled against her lips. "You've proven you know how to fight." They stood there as the sun completed its descent, as the stars began to emerge, as the celebration below them continued. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the degradation, the moment she'd stood in that saloon, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. She thought about the stranger who'd walked in and called her fire, who'd given her choice when she had none, who'd seen worth where others saw only trash. And she thought about who she'd become, not the Philadelphia girl, not the Bitter Creek widow, but something entirely new. Tuka Nukuma, fire who protects. A woman forged in the crucible of two worlds, belonging to both, and neither creating something unique in the space between. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, his arms tightening around her. "I'm thinking," Margaret said slowly, "about what the world tried to make me believe I was. Worthless, disposable, less than human, and I'm thinking about what you helped me become, strong, valued, free. You were always those things," Daniel said. "I just helped you remember." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the starlight. "No, you did more than that. You gave me a chance to prove it. To myself, to your people, to the world that tried to break me. You gave me fire, Daniel, and I intend to burn bright for the rest of my life." He kissed her, then deep and thorough, a promise and a celebration and a claim all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, the camp had grown quieter, families settling into their lodges for the night. "Come," Daniel said, taking her hand. "Little Wolf is staying with Shining Bird tonight. We have our own lodge now, our own beginning." Their lodge was smaller than Shining Bird's, but beautifully prepared, decorated with gifts from the community and warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows on the buffalo hide walls. Daniel led Margaret inside, his eyes dark with promise and love and desire. That night, in the warmth and privacy of their new home, Margaret truly became Daniel's wife. Their joining was tender and fierce, gentle and desperate, a physical manifestation of the emotional journey they'd traveled together. And afterward, lying in Daniel's arms, with her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong, Margaret felt something settle deep in her soul. She was home, finally truly home. The months that followed brought new rhythms, new joys, new challenges. Margaret settled into her role as Daniel's wife, as Little Wolf's mother, as a full member of the Comanche community. She learned to read the seasons, to prepare medicines, to track game alongside the hunters. Her Comanche became fluent, though she never lost her accent, something Little Wolf found endlessly amusing. Red Lance kept his distance, his hatred banked but never extinguished. Margaret learned to live with it, to accept that some wounds ran too deep for healing. But the majority of the camp embraced her, and that was enough. Spring came, bringing with it new life. Margaret discovered she was pregnant on a morning when the prairie was covered in wildflowers, and the joy in Daniel's eyes when she told him was worth every hardship she'd endured to reach this moment. A daughter, Little Wolf declared with absolute certainty when they shared the news with him. I want a sister, and we should call her Morning Star for my first mama. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Little Wolf, that's beautiful, but are you sure that's a big name to carry? The boy looked at her with wisdom beyond his years. My first mama brought me life. You brought me and Papa life again. A new sister should have both of you in her name. So, Morning Star, Fire, Fire, Star, Morning. He scrunched his nose. You pick. You're better at words. Daniel laughed, pulling them both close. Sarah Morning Star, he suggested. Sarah was your grandmother's name, he said to Margaret, and Morning Star honors both the woman who came before and the light that came after. Sarah Morning Star, Crow Feather. Margaret whispered her hand on her still flat belly. Our daughter, our bridge. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret was older than most first-time mothers in the camp, and her body had been weakened by the hardships of the past year. But Shining Bird and Quiet Rain tended her carefully, and Daniel hovered with protective concern that was equal parts endearing and exasperating. Sarah Morning Star was born on a winter night, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced her fierce spirit. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and from the moment Little Wolf held her, his expression transformed into pure adoration. My sister, he whispered, touching her tiny hand with reverent care. My fire star. Margaret watched her family, her husband, her son, her daughter, and felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. This was what she'd been surviving for, what all the pain and loss had been leading toward. Not to erase what came before, but to build something new from the ashes. Years passed, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Sarah grew strong and willful, as much at home on horseback as in her mother's arms. Little Wolf became a skilled hunter, his father's pride evident in every glance. The camp prospered, and Margaret's role evolved from outsider to elder, from fire who protects to simply Margaret, wife, mother, healer, teacher. Red Lance eventually left the camp, his grief finally driving him away to seek answers, or peace, or revenge, no one knew which. Some said he joined another band, others that he went to fight the white soldiers pushing ever westward. Margaret hoped wherever he was, he found some measure of peace. On Sarah's 5th birthday, as the family gathered around their fire, Little Wolf, now a young man of 13, asked his mother to tell the story again. The story of how she came to be here, how his father had saved her, how she had saved them all in return. Margaret looked at Daniel, seeking permission in his eyes. He nodded, and she began. Once, she said, her children leaning close, there was a woman the world called trash. She was sold, discarded, diminished until she believed she had no worth at all. But then a warrior walked into her darkness and saw not trash, but fire. And he gave her a choice, the first real choice she'd had in longer than she could remember. Sarah's eyes were wide. And she chose you, Papa. She chose us. She chose herself first. Daniel corrected gently. She chose to be free, to be strong, to be more than what others called her. We were just fortunate enough to be part of that choice. Margaret reached for Daniel's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Your father is right. I chose freedom. I chose love. I chose to burn bright instead of being extinguished. And every day since I've made that same choice, to be fire, to protect what matters, to refuse to be anything less than everything I am. Little Wolf smiled, the expression so much like his father's, it made Margaret's heart ache. That's why you're fire who protects, because you chose to burn. Yes, Margaret said, pulling her daughter close, looking at her son with pride, meeting her husband's eyes with love that had only deepened with time. I chose to burn, and in burning I found everything I never knew I needed. I found you. I found us. I found home. Outside their lodge, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. The moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across a world that had tried to break her but had instead forged her into something unbreakable. Margaret had been sold like trash, yes, but she had been loved like fire, fierce and transforming and eternal. And in that love, she had discovered a truth that no amount of cruelty could diminish, that worth isn't given by others. It's claimed by the soul brave enough to stand in its own light and say, "I am enough, I am fire, and I will not be extinguished." She had been Margaret Sullivan, widow of Bitter Creek, sold for $217 to settle debts she didn't owe, but she had become Tuka Nukuma, Fire, who protects, wife of Daniel Crow, feather mother to Little Wolf and Sarah, Morning Star, beloved member of a community that had given her what her own people never could: the freedom to choose her own path, to define her own worth, to burn as brightly as her spirit demanded. And as she sat there, surrounded by her family, the fire crackling before them, the stars wheeling overhead, in their ancient dance, Margaret smiled, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, real, chosen, fought for love, was stronger than any force that tried to diminish it. Stronger than prejudice, stronger than fear, stronger than the voices that whispered she would never be enough. She was fire, she had always been fire. And fire, once kindled in the heart of someone who refuses to be extinguished, burns forever, bright and fierce and utterly gloriously free.